By the summer of 1942, Erwin Rommel was the most famous general on earth. Not just in Germany, everywhere. British soldiers collected photographs of him. Churchill praised him on the floor of the House of Commons, while his own generals were failing to stop him. American newspapers called him a genius. He had taken a ragged Italian-German force across 600 miles of North African desert, outmaneuvered 3 different British commanders, and stood 90 miles from Alexandria with the entire Suez Canal, and with it, Britain's lifeline to its empire, within his grasp. The war in North Africa was effectively over. Everyone agreed on that. Then a small, wiry, intensely strange British general nobody outside the army had ever heard of stepped off a plane in Cairo, took command of the battered 8th Army, and told his troops something nobody had told them before. They were not going to retreat. Not one more step. They were going to destroy Rommel. The men who heard it had been retreating for 18 months. Somehow they believed him. They were right to. North Africa in 1942 was a theatre of war that seemed almost designed to produce legendary generalship and break conventional military thinking. The desert imposed its own brutal logic on everything. There were no civilians, no cities worth protecting, no complex terrain to hide behind. Just 600 miles of sand, rock, and heat between the Libyan border and the Nile Delta, with a single coastal road connecting everything. Supply lines were everything. Fuel was everything. The army that ran out of petrol stopped moving, and the army that stopped moving in the desert died. Both sides knew this. Both sides spent as much energy attacking the other's supply lines as attacking the other's troops. It was a war of movement and logistics played out at a scale and speed that conventional infantry warfare could not match. And it suited Rommel's instinctive fluid style almost perfectly, until it didn't. Britain's position in North Africa was not merely military. The Suez Canal was the artery through which the entire British Empire breathed. Oil from the Middle East, troops and supplies from India and Australia. The economic lifeblood of a global empire fighting for its survival. If Rommel reached the canal, Britain lost the empire. Churchill understood this with visceral clarity. It was why he kept replacing commanders who failed to stop Rommel, and why the arrival of Montgomery in August 1942 represented not just a change of personnel, but a last genuine chance to save the strategic position before it became irretrievable. Rommel's Africa cause had been in continuous action since February 1941, and by the summer of 1942 it was showing the strain, despite its extraordinary string of victories. Supply was the core problem. The Mediterranean crossing that kept Rommel's forces fed with fuel, ammunition and reinforcements was under constant attack from British naval and air forces based in Malta. Rommel was frequently fighting with a fraction of the supplies he needed, improvising and captured British equipment, filling the gaps. His genius for improvisation had carried him further than any reasonable assessment of his resources should have allowed. But improvisation has limits, and by El Alamein, those limits were approaching. Montgomery arrived in the desert and immediately did something none of his predecessors had managed. He stopped. He refused to attack until he was ready. He refused to be provoked, refused to be drawn into the kind of fluid mobile exchange where Rommel's instincts gave him an overwhelming advantage. He built up supplies, trained his army, unified his command structure, and prepared a battle so carefully and so thoroughly that when it began, he intended there to be no room for Rommel's genius to operate. When Rommel launched his last offensive at Alam Halfa in late August 1942, a final attempt to break through to Alexandria before British strength became overwhelming, Montgomery had anticipated every axis of advance. He did not pursue aggressively when Rommel's attack stalled. He let him retreat. He was not ready for the decisive battle yet, and he would not be rushed into it. The First Battle of El Alamein in October 1942 was the moment everything turned. Montgomery had 195,000 men against Rommel's 116,000. He had 1,000 tanks against Rommel's 500. He had complete air superiority. He had secure supply lines, and Rommel had almost none. A tanker carrying irreplaceable fuel had been sunk in the Mediterranean days before the battle began. Rommel himself was in Germany receiving medical treatment when Montgomery attacked and had to fly back to take command of a battle that was already going badly. Montgomery had deliberately chosen a style of fighting that nullified everything Rommel was best at. A grinding attritional assault that traded on material superiority rather than maneuver, that absorbed Rommel's counterattacks and kept the pressure relentless and unceasing. It lasted 12 days. The Afrika Korps was destroyed as a fighting force. Rommel retreated west across the same desert he had crossed in triumph the previous year. He never stopped retreating until the last German and Italian forces in North Africa surrendered in May 1943. Montgomery stood at El Alamein and was celebrated as the man who had finally beaten the Desert Fox. Churchill ordered church bells rung across Britain for the first time since the war began. It was the first significant British land victory of the entire war, and its psychological impact was enormous. The aftermath of El Alamein took both men to very different ends. Montgomery went on to command Allied ground forces in Sicily, Italy, and ultimately the D-Day invasion of Normandy, where his caution and his extraordinary difficulty as a colleague became increasingly problematic as the war shifted from defensive crisis to offensive campaign. His rivalry with American commanders, particularly Patton, became a persistent source of friction that threatened Allied cohesion at critical moments. He ended the war celebrated in Britain as a national hero and regarded by most American commanders as an insufferable egomaniac who had been brilliant in the desert and increasingly difficult everywhere else. He died in 1976, having spent 30 years defending every decision he had ever made with characteristic immodesty. Rommel's end was darker and more complicated. His association with the July 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler. He was aware of it, though the extent of his involvement remains disputed. Gave the Nazi regime the opportunity it needed and to remove a general who had become too famous and too independent to control. In October 1944, 2 SS generals arrived at his home and gave him a choice: face a public trial for treason, which would destroy his family, or take poison and be given a state funeral as a hero. Rommel walked into the garden and got into their car. He was dead within minutes. Germany gave him the state funeral. His family was left alone. The truth was buried for years. What the Rommel-Montgomery rivalry reveals is something essential about the nature of military genius and its limits. Rommel was perhaps the most gifted battlefield commander of the Second World War, a man whose instincts for fluid combat have never been surpassed and may never be equaled. Montgomery was not his equal as a battlefield improviser. He knew it, and he didn't care. He built a battle that didn't require improvisation, that converted material superiority into inevitable outcome, and that left Rommel's genius with nowhere to operate. He didn't beat Rommel at Rommel's game. He refused to play Rommel's game at all. There is a lesson in that which extends far beyond the desert. The most dangerous thing you can do against a brilliant opponent is fight them on their own terms. Montgomery's greatest victory was not El Alamein. It was the decision not to fight the battle Rommel wanted to fight. The Desert Fox met his match not in a faster fox, but in a man who had decided the desert would be his battlefield, not Rommel's. And he was right.